It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sun glinted off the skyscrapers of downtown Los Angeles, and the buzz of the city felt electric, like something big was about to happen. The TV networks were all tuned into one of the most anticipated live talk show events of the year, The Woke Chronicles, a show that prided itself on stirring up the cultural pot. The host, Tyler Madison, known for his sharp tongue and polarizing views, had invited Tom Cruise, Hollywood's golden boy, onto his show. The world was waiting. Tom Cruise, the star who had become synonymous with high-octane action and impeccable charm, was used to being the subject of admiration and gossip alike. His career had spanned decades, from Top Gun to Mission Impossible, and through it all, he had maintained an image that was both larger than life and remarkably grounded. People loved him. But recently, Cruise had come under fire from various groups for his outspoken political views and conservative stances. The media had often painted him as a relic of an outdated era, a man whose beliefs no longer resonated with the more progressive, woke wave that had taken over much of Hollywood. Tonight, however, was going to be different. Cruise had agreed to the interview, and Tyler Madison, eager to take down the legend, was determined to catch him in an uncomfortable moment. What Tyler didn't realize was that this would be the moment where Tom Cruise, for once, would not only stand his ground but completely turn the tables. The show's set was glitzy and high-tech, cameras flashing, the audience murmuring in excitement as the stage lights dimmed. Tyler, dressed in his signature trendy blazer, leaned over to his desk, speaking directly into the camera. His smirk was unmistakable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "tonight's guest is none other than Hollywood's controversial megastar, Tom Cruise. Known for his breathtaking stunts and his equally bold opinions, we're in for a ride tonight. Let's see if the old dog can learn new tricks or if he's stuck in his outdated ways." Cruise entered from stage left, walking calmly but confidently. The crowd erupted in applause as he waved politely, flashing a smile that was both genuine and enigmatic. He didn't need the loud cheers to know he was still the man, still the force to be reckoned with. Tyler, perched behind his desk, shot a glance at the audience before turning to Cruise. "Tom, welcome to the show," he said smoothly, trying to hide the challenge in his voice. "I'm sure everyone here is excited to hear from you, but let's be real for a second. A lot of people, especially younger folks, think you're a bit, well, out of touch. What do you say to that?" Tom raised an eyebrow, his trademark confidence flickering in his eyes, but his smile never wavered. He leaned slightly forward, exuding a calm that made Tyler momentarily question his own stance. "Tyler," he began, his voice steady but with a quiet intensity, "I've spent a lot of time listening to people, really listening, and I've realized something important. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's right. And just because something's new doesn't mean it's an improvement." Tyler shifted in his seat, taken aback by the bluntness of the response. He was expecting a more evasive answer, something that would play into the usual old-school Hollywood narrative, but this was different. Tom wasn't backing down. The tension in the room was palpable. "I'm not here to argue for or against anything. I'm just here to tell the truth," Tom continued, his voice calm but firm. "I've been in this industry long enough to know that we can't let what's trending dictate who we are, or what we stand for." The audience, sensing the shift, quieted down. Tyler's confidence faltered slightly, but he quickly regained composure. "So, you're saying that the younger generation, the ones who are all about change and progress, are wrong?" Tom let out a small laugh, the kind of laugh that made Tyler's words sound childish. "No, not at all. But there's a difference between progress and getting lost in a trend," Tom replied, his tone softening but still resolute. "Change is important, but it has to come from a place of understanding, not just because something is the in thing. When we forget the truth, when we stop asking the hard questions, that's when we lose ourselves." Tyler, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to push back. "But, Tom, don't you think your views are, well, a little outdated? The world is evolving, and you're not exactly known for being on the cutting edge of social change." The audience shifted in their seats, sensing where this conversation was heading. Tom's eyes locked onto Tyler's with a calm but piercing intensity. "Tyler, I'm not trying to be cutting edge," he said quietly, but with weight in his words. "I'm trying to be human. And if being human means standing up for what I believe in, then I'll do that, no matter what the trends say." The tension in the studio was thick, the audience hanging on every word, unsure of what was coming next. Tyler Madison had been known for his sharp, confrontational style, but Tom Cruise wasn't the typical celebrity who would let himself be pushed into a corner. Instead of getting defensive or irritated, Cruise leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused, as if he were contemplating the depth of Tyler's question rather than reacting to the snide tone behind it. Tom Cruise had been the face of Hollywood for decades. His name was synonymous with daring stunts, deep roles, and an undeniable magnetism that made him a legend in the film industry. But beneath that glitz and glamour was a man who had lived through everything, his career rising and falling, controversies and praise in equal measure. What people didn't see, though, was the quiet, philosophical side of Tom. While his public persona was one of high-flying action, the man himself was introspective, thoughtful, and remarkably grounded. He had seen the way the world was changing, and while he didn't oppose progress, he questioned the direction it was taking. Tyler Madison, on the other hand, was the embodiment of the woke era. A media darling known for calling out the injustices of society, Tyler's quick wit and confrontational tone had won him an army of young followers. They saw him as a hero, a voice for the voiceless, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. But while Tyler's rhetoric was revolutionary for many, it was also polarizing. He dismissed older generations, their values, and their ways of thinking, often labeling them as out of touch, unwilling to accept the New World Order. The real story, however, wasn't just about Tyler's challenge to Tom. It was the larger clash of two ideologies, the old guard, represented by Tom, and the progressive, fast-moving culture represented by Tyler. As the conversation progressed, the real stakes of the debate became clearer, not just the clash of personalities but of values and worldviews. Tyler smirked, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "So, you're saying you don't think the younger generation is right? That our push for equality, justice, and social change is misguided?" he pressed, leaning forward. Tom's eyes sharpened, and for a moment, the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. "No, I'm saying there's more to it than that," he replied, his voice cool and collected, but with an edge. "Younger generations are doing their best to right wrongs, but not every fight is worth fighting. And not every change is progress. Some things, Tyler, are timeless. And when we throw away the things that hold us together as a society, honor, respect, the pursuit of truth, well, that's when we risk losing ourselves." The audience was torn. Some applauded his words, feeling a sense of relief, while others bristled, uncomfortable with his refusal to fully embrace the so-called New World. Tom's response wasn't a direct attack, it wasn't even combative. It was more a call to reflection, a challenge to Tyler's conviction that change was always good, and to question whether the change was truly for the better. Tyler, clearly rattled but unwilling to back down, tried to regain the upper hand. "So, what you're saying is, you don't believe we should fight for social justice? That we shouldn't challenge systemic issues because it's uncomfortable?" His tone was rising, an attempt to corner Tom into a more definitive answer, something he could use to discredit him. Tom's gaze didn't waver. "What I'm saying, Tyler, is that true change doesn't come from throwing stones. It comes from understanding the people you're trying to change. It comes from humility, not arrogance. The minute we start seeing ourselves as better than others because we're woke or enlightened, we stop listening. We stop learning. We stop growing." There was a pause in the studio as those words settled over the room like a quiet storm. Some of the audience exchanged glances, not sure what to make of the subtle yet powerful weight behind Tom's response. Tyler's usual quick retorts were starting to feel a little less sharp, his armor not quite as impenetrable as it had been before. For a brief moment, Tyler hesitated, caught between his instincts to keep pushing and his awareness that Cruise wasn't the kind of man who would be easily cornered. He had underestimated him, thinking that he could rile him up and make him the butt of the joke. But now, Tyler realized, this was no ordinary conversation. This was the kind of conversation that forced you to examine your own beliefs, not just attack others. Tom leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more sincere tone. I know what it's like to be criticized, to be written off as outdated or irrelevant. But trust me, Tyler, you don't win people over by shouting at them. You win them over by understanding their fears, their struggles, and their humanity. The words hung in the air. In that moment, Tom's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Tyler's rising defensiveness. The young host's face twitched, a sign that his carefully constructed narrative was starting to unravel. He wasn't prepared for this. He had expected Tom to crumble under the pressure, to apologize, or worse, to turn the conversation into a self-deprecating joke. But instead, he was faced with a man who was unapologetically himself, someone who could face down the storm without breaking a sweat. As the minutes ticked on, it became clear this wasn't just an interview. It was a reckoning. The real conflict was unfolding beneath the surface, not just between the two men but between two different views of the world. And no one in that room, not the audience, not even the host himself, could have predicted the way it would end. The atmosphere in the studio was growing tense, like the quiet before a storm. Tom Cruise's words had unsettled Tyler Madison, and the audience could sense the shift in energy. Tyler's usual cocky bravado, the trademark smirk that had once made him so confident, was starting to fade. What had started as a simple confrontation between a star and a progressive host was beginning to reveal deeper layers that neither side had anticipated. The stakes were higher than they appeared, and both men were beginning to feel the weight of the conversation. Tyler, feeling the heat of the situation, shifted in his seat. He wasn't used to being outmatched. He prided himself on his ability to get under people's skin, to expose their flaws and make them squirm in the face of his relentless criticism. But Tom Cruise wasn't just a celebrity guest. He was a living legend, a man whose very presence commanded respect, and yet, here he was, calmly questioning everything Tyler had come to believe in. Okay, Tyler said, trying to regain control of the conversation. His voice was a little too loud, a little too forced, as though he were trying to cover up his growing discomfort. You talk about understanding, Tom, but what about accountability? What about the fact that so many people, especially in Hollywood, have been silent for too long while marginalized groups suffer? Are we supposed to sit back and just listen while injustice happens? Tom didn't flinch. He met Tyler's fiery gaze with a cool, unwavering look that seemed to pierce right through him. Accountability doesn't come from yelling at people or forcing them into a corner, he replied, his voice measured but firm. It comes from action. Real action. The kind that changes hearts and minds, not just trends on social media. Tyler's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, certainly not by someone who was supposed to be a symbol of everything he believed was wrong with the old world. And yet, there was Tom Cruise, sitting there with the same unshakable confidence he had exhibited on screen, refusing to bend or break. Well, maybe that's the problem, Tyler snapped, the edge of his frustration creeping into his voice. Maybe you're so busy with your career, your stunts, and your perfect life that you don't understand the struggles of people who don't have the luxury of turning a blind eye. The system is broken, Tom. You can't just act like everything is fine. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire room was holding its breath. There was a palpable tension now, a sense that this wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a battle of ideologies, of values, of beliefs. But Tom didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he simply sat there, still and composed. I'm not turning a blind eye, Tyler, he said, his voice steady. I'm just saying there's more to the story than what you're seeing on the surface. The world isn't just black and white. It's complicated. And if you want to make real change, you've got to start by listening to those you're trying to help. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Tyler's hand tightened around his microphone, but he didn't respond immediately. It was clear that Tom's calm demeanor and well-considered words had thrown him off balance. For the first time in the conversation, Tyler looked uncertain. But this was Tyler Madison's show, and he wasn't about to let a guest, no matter how famous, dictate the direction of the conversation. He had a reputation to uphold, a brand to protect. His followers, his fans, they were counting on him to be the voice of the new generation, the one who wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. And so, he pressed on. "All right, let's talk about that then," Tyler said, his tone now more calculated. "You talk about listening, but here's the thing, Tom. The people who need the most help, the ones who are oppressed, discriminated against, who don't have access to the same opportunities, do you think they have time for all this listening while they're struggling to survive?" Tom raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I don't think you're listening to me, Tyler," he said softly. "Listening isn't about being passive. It's about being present. It's about understanding that change takes time, and it takes more than just jumping on a bandwagon because it's the thing to do. It's about real, meaningful work." The tension in the studio thickened again. It was clear that Tyler's strategy to corner Tom wasn't going as planned. Tyler, in his youth and zeal, had expected crews to buckle under pressure, to fall into the trap of dismissing the very real issues that young people were fighting for. Instead, Tom was standing tall, his responses quiet but profound, like an immovable force against the storm of Tyler's accusations. As the conversation continued, the underlying friction between the two began to build, and the first cracks in Tyler's confidence became visible. The audience, who had initially been excited for the drama and the clash of personalities, now found themselves on the edge of their seats, unsure of which side to take. Tyler's aggressive tactics seemed increasingly misplaced, and Tom's calm wisdom seemed to resonate more deeply with the viewers than Tyler's rhetoric ever could. But it wasn't just Tyler's frustration that was growing. Tom was beginning to see the deeper issue. This wasn't just about him and Tyler. This was a larger conflict, one that was playing out across the nation. The younger generation, eager for change but sometimes too quick to judge, versus the older generation, who had seen how quickly society could shift and didn't always trust that every change was for the better. And as the interview pressed on, a new challenge emerged for Tom. In his attempt to maintain a sense of grace and understanding, he had inadvertently invited deeper scrutiny of his own views. Tyler's questions weren't just about the world at large anymore. They were about Tom's own beliefs, his past, and his very identity. Was Tom Cruise truly open to change? Was he, in fact, the right person to lead this conversation? And as the tension escalated, it became clear that the conflict wasn't just ideological, it was personal. Tyler was no longer just challenging Tom's beliefs. He was trying to provoke a reaction, to make Tom take a stand that might fracture the very image he had spent his career building. It was clear that the conversation was heading into uncharted territory, and neither Tom nor Tyler knew exactly where it would go from here. The tension in the studio had reached a boiling point. The audience was almost paralyzed, their eyes flicking between Tyler's sharp, aggressive demeanor and Tom's calm, unwavering presence. The air felt heavy, as though every word spoken was being meticulously measured, as if the entire world was waiting for someone to make the next move. Tyler, clearly frustrated with how the interview had gone so far, began shifting tactics. He needed a win. The host had made a name for himself by confronting the powerful, exposing the flaws in their arguments, and flipping the script on his guests. But Tom Cruise, with all his quiet strength, wasn't falling for any of it. Tyler's mind raced for a way to regain control, something, anything, to break through Tom's steely facade. He could sense that his usual methods weren't working, that his audience, once so eager for confrontation, was beginning to turn. "Tell me this, Tom," Tyler said, his voice now dripping with sarcasm. "You're telling me that it's not about changing things? That we should just let the world keep turning, even as more and more people are left behind? You, of all people, with your massive influence, think it's enough to just listen and understand?" Tom sat back in his chair, his expression remaining unchanged. There was a momentary silence, and then he leaned in slightly, his voice calm yet firm. "I'm not saying to do nothing, Tyler. I'm saying we have to be careful about what kind of change we're pushing for. Because some changes aren't for the better, they're destructive. And sometimes, it's the people at the forefront of those changes who end up hurting the very people they're trying to help." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tyler's brow furrowed, his mind racing. He had hoped to provoke Tom into a passionate defense of his views, to create a spectacle that would make the headlines. But now, Tom's words were hitting harder than Tyler had anticipated. There was an authenticity to his argument that made Tyler feel like he was losing ground. He could feel his grip on the conversation slipping. Destructive? Tyler repeated, his voice rising. What do you mean by that? Are you saying that the fight for equality, for justice, is destructive? That the changes we're fighting for, all the people who've suffered, that they're wrong? Tom shook his head slowly, his gaze unwavering. No. What I'm saying is that the world doesn't change overnight. You can't fix centuries of oppression with a single wave of a hand. But if you push too hard, too fast, without truly understanding the people you're trying to help, you risk causing more harm than good. People get hurt in the process. They get lost. And in the end, you haven't helped anyone. You've only created more chaos. The words stung. Tyler knew Tom had a point, everyone did. But the message was subtle, and it was starting to make Tyler feel small. His entire worldview, one that he had built and curated with careful conviction, was being dismantled bit by bit, not through grand confrontations, but with quiet, thoughtful wisdom. For someone who had made a career out of challenging and questioning authority, Tyler realized he was beginning to question himself. Suddenly, Tyler's thoughts were interrupted by a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. A camera shot caught something unexpected. One of the younger staff members behind the scenes was looking at the debate with a mix of admiration and concern, clearly moved by Tom's words. The staff member, a young woman in her early 20s, had been quiet throughout the show, but now, she seemed to be engaged in what was unfolding on the stage. This moment sparked a realization in Tyler. The conversation was no longer just about him and Tom. It was bigger. The divide between the older and younger generations was clear, but there was more at play here. The staff member wasn't the only one being affected. The audience, many of them in their 20s and 30s, were beginning to rethink their assumptions about the fight for change. Tyler was realizing that even those who supported him might not see the world exactly the way he did. They might have been listening to him because they were following a trend, rather than questioning the deeper implications of the movement. But Tyler couldn't back down. This was his show, his moment to prove that his ideals, his generation, had the power to shape the future. He needed to finish this, to prove that his brand of activism was valid. I'm sorry, Tom, Tyler said, his voice now tinged with disbelief, but I can't sit here and let you undermine everything I've been working for. You're talking about chaos, about pushing too hard, but what about the people who've been pushed down for so long? They're not just looking for understanding, they're looking for action. For results. The room went silent, all eyes on Tom now. The weight of Tyler's words hung heavy in the air, and the audience could feel the moment stretch out. Would Tom crumble? Would he soften his stance? This was the showdown everyone had been waiting for. Tom didn't respond immediately. He glanced briefly at the camera, then back at Tyler. Results come, but they come in different forms, Tyler. Sometimes they're quiet. Sometimes, the biggest change happens when no one is watching, when it's just one person listening to another. You can't demand change by force. The heart doesn't work that way. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. On one hand, Tom was still calm, his voice steady and compassionate, like a mentor gently correcting a student. On the other, Tyler was spiraling, desperate to maintain control of the narrative, to not let Tom's wisdom overpower his vision. The room wasn't just divided, it was beginning to split in ways that neither host nor guest had anticipated. At that moment, a secondary conflict began to emerge. Tyler's team, the younger staffers and producers who had supported his aggressive stance on the show, were beginning to question the way Tyler had handled the interview. Some were beginning to side with Tom, recognizing the quiet strength of his argument. Others were uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, worried that the show's brand of bold confrontation was losing its edge. Behind the scenes, Tyler's producer whispered in his ear, urging him to push harder. But Tyler couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he was losing control, not just of the interview, but of the narrative he had built around himself. this wasn't just about Tom Cruise anymore. It was about Tyler's identity, his career, and the very thing that had brought him success. The realization began to gnaw at him. Was he truly fighting for the right cause? Or had he been swept up in his own narrative, trying to force change in a way that only divided people further? Tom could see the conflict brewing in Tyler. He didn't need to say anything more. His calm had already done the job. Tyler was starting to question the methods he had lived by, and it was only a matter of time before his followers would do the same. The studio lights felt blinding now, more intense than before. The camera crew, the staff, even the audience, everyone was caught in a silent, breathless moment. Tyler Madison, the host who had once prided himself on his ability to control every interview, every conversation, was now visibly rattled. His usual arrogance had slipped away, leaving a man who seemed vulnerable, unsure of the next words to speak. It was as if time had paused, and all eyes were on him, waiting to see how he would respond to the calm, unwavering force sitting across from him. Tom Cruise, the man who had always been known for his action-packed roles and unwavering confidence on screen, had just delivered a bombshell, an argument that Tyler couldn't easily dismiss or ignore. The weight of Tom's words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. "I understand that your generation wants results, Tyler," Tom said, breaking the silence that had lingered far too long. "But sometimes, the way we go about it can undermine the very people we're trying to help. You can't force change by demanding it. That's not how real transformation works." Tyler's fists were clenched, and his jaw tightened. It wasn't just the words that stung, it was the undeniable truth in them. For the first time, Tyler realized how deeply his approach to activism had been shaped by his desire for control, his desire to be the one who could wield influence. His need to prove himself, to show the world he was right, had become more important than the cause itself. The people who needed help weren't statistics to use as a platform, they were real individuals who deserved dignity, respect, and understanding. But that realization wasn't something Tyler could easily accept. He wasn't ready to let go of the narrative he had built for himself. The pressure of the moment bore down on him as he tried to find his footing, desperate for a way to regain his control. "Tom," he began, his voice shaky but still defiant, "you say that change can't come from demanding it, but isn't that exactly what we've been doing? The old system doesn't listen unless it's forced to. People have been oppressed for far too long, and if we don't push hard enough, nothing will ever change." Tom didn't respond immediately. He let Tyler's words hang in the air, giving the host a moment to collect himself. Then, with quiet resolve, Tom spoke again. "You think the system is listening because it's being forced to change, but what you're missing is that true change comes when the people in power realize it's not about them anymore. It's about the people who are too often forgotten. When we move from a place of compassion, not confrontation, that's when the real power shifts. You can't force someone to change their heart, Tyler. You can only inspire it." The audience shifted in their seats. Tom's words were no longer just about the disagreement between him and Tyler. They were about something larger, something that reached deep into the hearts of the viewers. The debate wasn't merely ideological now, it was about what kind of society everyone wanted to build, what kind of change was truly worth fighting for. The show had begun as a spectacle, a war of words, a clash of egos, but now it had transformed into something else entirely. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was no longer about proving who was right or wrong. It was about truth, about vulnerability, and about the weight of the actions each person took in this world. Tyler's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape, a way to deflect. The audience was no longer merely watching, they were involved. They were feeling the weight of this conversation, and they were choosing sides in the quietest, most powerful way. Some were nodding, absorbing Tom's wisdom, while others were tense, anxious, waiting for Tyler to somehow salvage the conversation. He had never been one to back down. But now, faced with the quiet authority of Tom's words, Tyler realized something deep within him. He wasn't sure he believed in the way he had been fighting. Was his idea of activism too aggressive? Too much focused on outrage, on division? Could it be that in his attempt to bring about change, he was only pushing people further apart? Was he part of the problem? His voice trembled slightly as he spoke again. And what about people like me, Tom? People who are trying to make a difference. You act like I'm just shouting into the void. But I'm doing what I can to make people listen, by creating more division. Tom interrupted gently. That's the problem, Tyler. Making noise doesn't make people listen. You think you're shaking things up, but all you're doing is adding to the noise. There's a difference between shaking up the system and tearing it down without understanding what's left behind. Tyler recoiled at the words, and for a split second, the studio seemed to freeze. The impact of Tom's calm words struck harder than any blow. Tyler had always been the one to tear things down. He had built his career on confronting, challenging, and opposing anything to get a reaction. But now, in the face of Tom's quiet confidence, Tyler began to wonder if he had been wrong all along. Had his style of activism truly been about creating real change, or had it just been a way for him to amplify his voice? For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The challenge in the air was not only for Tyler, but for everyone watching, the audience, the staff behind the scenes, and anyone who had ever been caught up in the noise of a divisive world. Then, just as Tyler's walls began to crack, something unexpected happened, a subtle shift in the energy around him. One of the staff members, the young woman who had been standing behind the camera earlier, spoke up. Her voice was soft but clear, and it cut through the tension like a thread of clarity. Tyler, she said, looking directly at him, I used to think the same way you do. That shouting louder would make people listen. But after everything I've seen, everything we've all been through, I realize now that true change doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from understanding. Tyler looked at her, his eyes wide, and for a fleeting second, he saw something in her face, something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just admiration for Tom. It was a challenge. A challenge he wasn't ready to face, but one that had been quietly planted in his heart. This was it, the moment that would define everything. The tension in the room reached its peak, and all eyes turned to Tyler. His career, his ideals, his identity, they all hung in the balance. The world was waiting to see what he would choose. Would he continue down the path of confrontation and division, or would he listen to the quiet, powerful truth that had been laid before him? The weight of the moment lingered in the air, as the studio felt unnervingly still. Tyler, his mind racing, glanced from Tom to the young staff member who had spoken up, and then back to Tom. There was no turning back now. The confrontation had escalated from a heated debate into a challenge that was as much internal as it was external. The audience was on the edge of their seats, hanging on every word, every shift in Tyler's expression. The tension that had been building throughout the interview had reached its peak. Now, they were witnessing something unexpected, the unraveling of the host who had always prided himself on having the final word. For the first time, it was clear, Tyler was questioning everything he had built his career on. He took a deep breath. His jaw tightened, but there was something different in the way he held himself. The arrogance that had fueled him throughout his career was beginning to fade, replaced by uncertainty and something deeper, vulnerability. He had always thought that strength came from being loud, from dominating the conversation. But now, the silence in the room, the quiet intensity of Tom's words, and the support from an unexpected ally were forcing him to confront a different kind of strength. Tom sat there, calm and collected, watching him closely. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were filled with quiet conviction. He wasn't here to win or lose, he was here to show a better way. Tom's voice, though soft, carried the weight of someone who had lived through the highs and lows of life, someone who had seen the destructive power of division and confrontation. Tyler, Tom said, his tone unyielding yet compassionate, real change comes from a place of understanding. You can't force people to listen to you. You have to show them that you're listening first. That's how you create lasting impact. The words hit harder than anything Tyler had ever heard. They pierced through the facade of bravado he had built around himself. For a fleeting moment, Tyler's defenses crumbled. His mind raced through his own past, the interviews, the controversies, the battles he had fought and won. But those victories felt hollow now. What had he truly changed? What had he really accomplished, beyond sparking outrage and division. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The usual, sharp retort was absent. Instead, he felt exposed, as though the layers of his own certainty had been peeled away. Tom wasn't finished. "It's okay to let go of the fight sometimes," he continued. "Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is listen. To let the noise settle and hear what the other side is saying. That's where the real strength lies." The room had shifted. What started as a confrontation was now evolving into a quiet revelation. The audience, who had been waiting for the drama, for the bold retort or the heated comeback, was now witnessing something much more powerful, a moment of reflection. Tyler's grip on the microphone tightened. He looked out at the audience, then at the crew behind the cameras. Their faces, once filled with anticipation, were now marked by something else: hope, understanding, and a shared realization that this conversation was bigger than any of them had anticipated. Tom's voice softened. "You don't need to prove yourself, Tyler. People will listen when they know you're speaking from a place of truth. And that truth comes from a willingness to understand, not to dominate." A deep, heavy silence followed. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Was Tom right? Was everything he had fought for, everything he had built, based on the wrong premise? Could he truly change the way he operated, or was it too late? But then, in that moment of intense self-reflection, Tyler realized something. He wasn't alone in this journey. The young staff member who had spoken up earlier was no longer just a voice from the background, she was a mirror of what was happening inside him. Tyler had been so focused on proving his point, on forcing change, that he had ignored the most powerful tool of all: compassion. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, Tyler finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual but carrying a weight that felt genuine. "You're right. Maybe I've been going about this all wrong. I've been too focused on the noise, on pushing my own agenda. Maybe it's time to listen." For the first time in the interview, Tyler didn't feel the need to argue. He didn't need to fight to keep his narrative intact. Instead, he allowed Tom's words to settle into him, allowing a new path to emerge, one that didn't require confrontation, but instead understanding. Tom gave him a simple nod, a small but meaningful gesture that told Tyler everything he needed to know. This was the moment of change, the turning point that could not be undone. As the room took in the weight of Tyler's shift, the audience seemed to release a collective breath, and the air in the studio lightened. The tension that had once been thick and oppressive now felt manageable, and for the first time in the interview, there was a sense of hope in the room. Not because Tyler had won, but because both men, despite their differences, had found common ground in the most unexpected of places. The stakes had never been higher for Tyler, and in this critical moment, he realized that his true strength lay not in being right, but in the willingness to grow, to listen, and to change. The hum of the studio lights seemed distant now, as if the world outside the interview had faded into a blur. The tension that had filled the room only moments ago had dissolved into a quiet, introspective atmosphere. It was no longer about competing ideologies or a battle of wills. It had become something deeper, something more meaningful. Tyler Madison sat back in his chair, a slight shift in his posture that indicated a newfound humility. The audience could sense the change, though no words had been exchanged. The walls around him, the ones that had once shielded his arrogance and his need to be right, were beginning to crack. His gaze flickered to Tom, who sat with the same quiet, unwavering composure as before. The actor didn't look for a victory, he wasn't looking for an applause or a grand acknowledgement. He was simply there to speak his truth, and in doing so, he had created a space for Tyler to reflect on his own. For the first time in the entire broadcast, Tyler's voice wasn't filled with anger or confrontation. Instead, there was a trace of something vulnerable, something that had been buried deep under years of media battles and controversial opinions. Maybe I've been fighting the wrong battles," Tyler said, his tone softer than anyone had ever heard on his show. "I've been so focused on making noise, on pushing a message, that I didn't realize I was missing the most important part of this conversation." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The people who need to be heard. They're not listening to the noise. They're waiting for us to listen to them. Tom nodded, but his expression remained calm and nonchalant. There was no need for him to press further, no need to give Tyler a lecture. The humility that had begun to emerge in Tyler's voice was a shift that needed no commentary. It was the kind of change that couldn't be forced, it had to come from within. The audience, once eager for a heated confrontation, now saw the emotional depth in the moment. Their initial excitement had given way to a sense of reverence. It was rare to see someone on television, especially someone as high-profile as Tyler, acknowledge their mistakes in real time. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't for show. It was real. For a few moments, the studio felt more like a classroom than a television set. Tyler was no longer the arrogant host or the activist trying to impose his beliefs. He was simply a person, vulnerable, questioning, and searching for a better way to engage with the world. Maybe it's time to stop shouting, Tyler continued, his voice steady now. Maybe it's time to start listening, and really hearing what people are saying, without jumping in to argue. His eyes met Tom's. I've spent so much time trying to be right. I forgot that being right isn't what matters most. It's about how you make people feel. It's about lifting them up, not putting them down. The quiet in the room was palpable. The host, once the loudest voice in the room, now spoke with a softness that no one had expected. He wasn't just talking about the interview or the disagreement they had. He was talking about his own journey, the journey of personal growth that had taken place in real time, in front of millions of viewers. The transformation wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional, spiritual. Tom, though outwardly the same as he had been throughout the interview, looked at Tyler with a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't expected to be a teacher today, but it was clear now that his words had struck a chord with the host. His role had shifted from celebrity to mentor in the most unexpected of ways. Tyler continued, his voice gaining confidence. It's funny. We spend so much time telling people what they need to do, what they should believe. But the real change comes when we stop telling and start listening. And then, maybe, just maybe, we can help make the world a better place, together. As the words left his mouth, the audience erupted into applause. The kind of applause that wasn't for a performance, but for something more profound. For a man who had been willing to change, in front of everyone. For a man who had found the courage to acknowledge his flaws. Tom smiled warmly, nodding as if to say, "You've got it now." There was no grand moment of victory here, no overblown declaration. It was simply the recognition that, in that moment, both men had won something far more important than an argument. Behind the cameras, the crew exchanged looks, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of disbelief. What they had witnessed in the last hour was unlike anything they had expected from a live talk show. There was no explosive drama, no scandalous moments to tweet about, there was something much more powerful, an authentic conversation. As the applause subsided, Tyler turned toward Tom, gratitude in his eyes. I think I've learned more in this interview than I ever did in 1,000 heated debates. Tom gave him a slight grin, his voice low but meaningful. That's the beauty of it, Tyler. You never stop learning. And sometimes, the best lessons come when you least expect them. For the first time in years, Tyler felt at peace. Not because he had won, but because he had found clarity. He had found a way to truly engage with the world, with people, in a way that was meaningful. It wasn't about being loud or forcing change, it was about listening, understanding, and creating space for dialogue. As the show came to an end, the credits began to roll, but the conversation didn't end there. The influence of this moment would ripple out, far beyond the walls of the studio. It would reach the hearts of the millions who had tuned in to witness the clash of ideologies, and perhaps, more importantly, the coming together of two people who had learned something that could change their lives forever. The final moments of the show were unlike any Tyler had experienced in his career. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the crew began to pack up, but the energy in the room remained electric. A sense of calm had replaced the earlier tension, and yet, there was an undeniable weight in the air. Tyler sat there, eyes forward, still processing the conversation that had just unfolded. As the credits rolled, Tom stood up, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He turned to Tyler, who was still lost in his thoughts, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've taken the first step, my friend," Tom said softly, his voice grounded in sincerity. "Change starts with moments like this." Tyler looked up, his face now free of the hardened expression that had once defined him. His features were softer, and in his eyes, there was a flicker of something new, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. "I appreciate you," Tyler said, his voice low, almost reflective. "I didn't expect this conversation to change everything. Hell, I didn't expect it to change me." Tom smiled, giving him a small nod. "That's the power of perspective. Sometimes, we need someone to help us see what we couldn't on our own." Tyler chuckled, shaking his head. "I always thought I was the one doing the teaching. Guess I was wrong about that." Tom's grin deepened. "No one ever stops learning. That's the trick." The two men stood there for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them. It was clear that this wasn't just a moment of change for Tyler, it was a shift in the way they both viewed the world, the way they interacted with it. It wasn't about being right or wrong anymore. It was about connecting, understanding, and sharing the space where real growth happened. As the crew began to disperse, Tyler turned to his team. "Let's scrap the rest of the show," he said, his voice still filled with the weight of his newfound realization. "We'll post an online segment, something more genuine. This is bigger than the usual headlines. Let's take a moment to reflect." His staff exchanged surprised glances, but they didn't argue. They were witnessing something rare, a man, at the height of his career, willing to break away from the script and acknowledge something more important than ratings or controversy. A man ready to lead by example, not just by words. As the final moments of the live show aired, and the cameras cut off, Tyler looked at the screen, his mind still processing the profound nature of what had just occurred. He wasn't the same person who had sat in that chair an hour ago, brimming with pride and certainty. No, he was someone different, a person who had listened, who had been challenged, and who had accepted the challenge to change. In the days that followed, the internet buzzed with reactions to the unexpected turn of events. Some were surprised by Tyler's sudden shift, others skeptical. But one thing was undeniable: his message had struck a chord. People were talking, not just about the confrontation, but about the idea that real progress wasn't found in stubbornness, but in openness. Tyler's show went on, but it was clear that the tone had shifted. The interviews became less about controversy and more about dialogue. He asked harder questions, but he also gave room for answers that weren't always easy to hear, but always worth listening to. As for Tom, his role in that moment was subtle but powerful. He had not come to tear down Tyler, but to show him that there was a better way to engage with the world. His words, quiet as they had been, had planted a seed in Tyler's mind, one that would continue to grow long after the cameras turned off. In the end, Tyler understood what Tom had always known: true power doesn't come from being loud or dominating the conversation. It comes from listening, understanding, and making room for others to be heard. The interview had started as a clash, a battle of ideologies. But it ended as something much more meaningful, an opportunity for both men to grow, to learn, and to inspire others to do the same.